It was a bright, crisp morning at the small regional airport, and Thomas Harris, a middle-aged black farmer with years of hard work etched into the lines of his face, stepped out of his weathered pickup truck. The vehicle, though clean and well-maintained, stood in stark contrast to the rows of luxury cars parked in front of the showroom. His denim jacket and work boots hinted at a man who had spent most of his life toiling the fields, not someone who would typically be browsing private jets. But Thomas was not here to bend in. He was here for something he'd dreamed about for years, a plane that would revolutionize his farming business. Inside the sleek, modern showroom, conversations hushed the moment Thomas walked in. Rows of pristine aircraft gleamed under the bright showroom lights, each carrying a hefty price tag that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who didn't look the part. As Thomas took his first steps into the space, his heart beat steadily. He wasn't new to this feeling, the stares, the silent judgments, the questioning of his presence. But he had learned long ago how to stand tall in the face of doubt. Greg Simmons, one of the sales associates, leaned against the polished counter, his tailored suit and smug smile radiating superiority. He didn't bother to hide his disdain as Thomas approached. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone more skeptical than welcoming. Thomas met his gaze evenly. "Yes, I'm here to look at the Model X900. I've read it's efficient for both short and long distances. That's what I need for my business." Greg blinked, momentarily thrown off by Thomas's confident tone. But his skepticism quickly returned. "The Model X900, he repeated, drawing out the words as though tasting their weight. "You know that's one of our top-tier models, right? Perhaps I could direct you to something more accessible." His eyes flicked to Thomas's boots, then back up to his face. Thomas didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I'm here for. Is it available for viewing?" A chuckle rose from a nearby group of customers, their expensive suits and polished shoes gleaming under the lights. One of them, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's got ambition, I'll give him that. But I hope he's not expecting a payment plan on something like this." Thomas ignored the comment, his jaw tightening as he looked Greg square in the eyes. "I asked if it's available for viewing." Greg hesitated, then gestured toward the far end of the showroom. "It's over there," he said, his voice laced with doubt. "But I should warn you, it's not exactly cheap." Thomas walked toward the plane without another word. The jet was everything he'd imagined, sleek, powerful, and built to handle the demands of his growing business. He could already picture how it would transform the way he transported goods, saving time and opening new opportunities. But as he turned to discuss the details with Greg, the air in the room seemed to thicken. "Oh, you're leaving already?" The man with the salt and pepper hair smirked, his voice dripping with mockery. "I thought someone as ambitious as you might try to prove something. Or maybe you realize this isn't your league." The taunt hung in the air, echoing through the showroom. Thomas froze, his hands clenching at his sides. This wasn't the first time he faced this kind of treatment, but something about this moment felt different. He turned slowly, his steps deliberate, his gaze locking onto the man. The room fell silent as every eye turned to watch the unfolding confrontation. "What do you want me to prove?" Thomas's voice was calm, but carried an edge that demanded attention. His eyes, filled with quiet determination, scanned the room. "I didn't come here to impress anyone. I came here to get what I deserve." The silence was deafening, the tension thick enough to cut. Greg shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, the smug confidence on his face faltering. The salt and pepper man opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a check, holding it high for all to see. The number on it made jaws drop. For the first time since he'd entered the showroom, the sneers and whispers stopped. The mocking laughter vanished. All that remained was stunned silence as Thomas walked toward Greg, extending the check. "You're right," Thomas said, his voice steady and sharp. "Words don't buy anything, but money does. And I've got what it takes to turn my dreams into reality." As Greg stared at the check, struggling to process what was happening, the salt and pepper man looked away, his earlier arrogance replaced by discomfort. The room that had been so full of disdain now felt heavy with the weight of unspoken regret. But this wasn't over. Thomas knew that money alone couldn't erase the humiliation he'd just endured, and as he stepped back toward the door, leaving behind a room of stunned onlookers, a storm of determination brewed inside him. This wasn't just about buying a plane anymore. It was about standing up to a system that judged people by appearances, about proving that dignity and worth couldn't be measured by a suit or a car. As he reached his truck, Thomas paused and pulled out his phone. With steady hands, he dialed a number and brought the phone to his ear. "Marcus," he said when the line connected, "I need you to meet me here. We've got something to take care of." Thomas didn't know what the next steps would bring, but he was certain of one thing: this was far from over. And the people in that showroom? They were about to learn a lesson they'd never forget. Thomas leaned against the side of his truck, the weight of the encounter inside the showroom pressing heavily on his shoulders. The check was still in his hand, crisp and untouched, but it felt heavier than it should. He stared at it for a moment before slipping it back into his pocket. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had spent years working tirelessly to build his farming business, rising before the sun and going to bed long after it set. Every acre of his land, every piece of equipment, and every deal he closed had been the result of sheer grit and determination. Yet, in a matter of minutes, these strangers had reduced him to nothing more than a man in worn boots and a denim jacket. The phone in his hand buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Marcus, his son, calling him back. "I'm on my way," Marcus said, his voice steady, but with an edge of concern. "You okay, Dad?" Thomas took a deep breath, trying to steady the frustration boiling within him. "I'm fine," he replied. "Just get here. I'll explain everything when you do." Marcus didn't press further, but Thomas knew his son would be furious when he found out. Marcus had always been protective, fiercely so, and had no patience for injustice. As a lawyer, he'd built his career standing up for people who couldn't fight for themselves. The fact that his father had been subjected to such blatant disrespect would ignite a fire in him like nothing else. Thomas looked back at the showroom, its glass walls gleaming in the sunlight, and wondered how things had gone so wrong. All he had wanted was to purchase a tool to help his business grow. The jet wasn't about luxury or showing off. It was about efficiency. He needed it to transport perishable goods quickly, to reach markets that could bring in better prices for his produce. This wasn't a dream born out of vanity, but of necessity, and he'd worked hard to make it a reality. The arrival of his son's car broke his train of thought. Marcus stepped out, his presence commanding as always. His tailored suit and polished shoes made him look like he belonged in the showroom far more than Thomas ever could. But it wasn't just his appearance. It was the way he carried himself, with confidence and purpose. Marcus had a way of making people pay attention when he entered a room. "Dad," Marcus said as he approached, his voice steady but laced with concern. "What happened?" Thomas hesitated, unsure of how to put the humiliation he'd endured into words. "It's nothing," he began, but Marcus gave him a sharp look that made it clear he wasn't buying it. "It's not nothing if you called me," Marcus said firmly. "Tell me everything." Thomas sighed and relayed the events, from the mocking stares to the condescending remarks and the man's outright taunt. He explained how he pulled out the check, determined to silence them, but how even that hadn't erased the sting of their disdain. By the time he finished, Marcus's jaw was tight, and his eyes burned with anger. "They treated you like that?" he asked, his voice low but deadly serious. "They looked down on you because of your clothes, your truck, your work?" Thomas nodded, his expression calm but wary. "It's not the first time, son. You know that as well as I do." Marcus's fists clenched at his sides. "It doesn't make it right," he said. "They need to be held accountable for this." Thomas placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm, but gentle. "I didn't call you to start a fight, Marcus. I needed someone who'd understand. Someone who'd listen." Marcus met his father's gaze, his expression softening slightly. "I understand, Dad. But this isn't just about listening. This is about making sure they don't treat anyone else like this again. Thomas sighed, knowing his son wouldn't let it go. He admired Marcus's passion, but he also worried about what it might lead to. Still, he couldn't deny the pride swelling in his chest. Marcus was fighting for something bigger than both of them, and that meant something. "All right," Thomas said finally. "What do you want to do?" Marcus glanced back at the showroom, his eyes narrowing as if he could see straight through the glass walls to the people inside. "I want to make them face what they've done," he said. "And I want them to understand that you're not someone they can dismiss." They walked back toward the building together, Thomas feeling a strange mix of apprehension and resolve. As they entered, the room grew quiet once more, the air thick with unease. Greg, the sales associate, looked up and visibly paled at the sight of Marcus. The salt-and-pepper-haired man shifted uncomfortably, avoiding their gaze. Marcus strode up to the counter, his steps purposeful. "Who's in charge here?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an authority that couldn't be ignored. Greg stammered, "I am just a sales associate." "That's not what I asked," Marcus said sharply. "Who is in charge?" A nervous silence followed before Greg reluctantly gestured toward a door at the back of the showroom. "The manager's office is back there," he said. Marcus nodded and turned to Thomas. "Wait here, Dad. I'll handle this." Thomas hesitated, unsure of what his son had in mind, but Marcus's expression left no room for argument. He watched as Marcus disappeared into the office, his back straight and his head held high. The room seemed to hold its breath as the minutes ticked by. Thomas could feel the eyes of the other customers on him, their curiosity barely veiled. He tried to ignore them, focusing instead on steadying his own nerves. Whatever Marcus was doing, he trusted his son to handle it with the same determination and fairness he brought to everything else. When Marcus finally emerged, the manager trailing behind him, the tension in the room was palpable. The manager, a middle-aged woman with a professional demeanor, looked uneasy but composed. Marcus turned to address the room, his voice steady and clear. "This is my father, Thomas Harris," he began. "He's a hard-working man who came here today with every intention of purchasing an aircraft. Instead, he was met with disrespect, prejudice, and humiliation." The room was silent, every eye fixed on Marcus as he spoke. Thomas felt a swell of pride at his son's words, even as he wished they didn't have to be spoken at all. "We're not here to cause trouble," Marcus continued. "We're here to make it clear that this kind of treatment is unacceptable. My father's worth isn't defined by his clothes or his truck. It's defined by the life he's built through hard work and integrity. And it's time everyone in this room understands that." The manager stepped forward, her expression contrite. "Mr. Harris," she said, addressing Thomas directly. "On behalf of the showroom, I want to sincerely apologize for the way you were treated today. It was wrong, and we'll be taking steps to ensure it doesn't happen again." Thomas nodded, accepting the apology but knowing it wouldn't erase what had happened. Still, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, this was a step in the right direction. As they left the showroom together, Thomas and Marcus didn't speak, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. This wasn't just about one counter or one showroom. It was about challenging the assumptions and prejudices that still lingered in places they shouldn't. And while the fight wasn't over, they both knew they wouldn't back down. Not now, and not ever. As they drove away from the showroom, the air in the truck was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Thomas gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the worn leather. He could feel Marcus's eyes on him, waiting for him to speak, but he wasn't ready yet. The humiliation still simmered under his skin, the words of those men replaying in his mind like an unwanted echo. Marcus finally broke the silence. "You didn't have to just walk away, Dad. You had every right to stand your ground." Thomas sighed, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I've been standing my ground my whole life, son. Sometimes it feels like it doesn't matter how hard I fight. They'll always see me the same way." "That's not a reason to let them win," Marcus said, his voice firm. "You've worked too hard to let them treat you like that." "I didn't let them win," Thomas replied quietly. "I just chose not to play their game." Marcus leaned back in his seat, frustrated but understanding. He knew his father wasn't a man who sought out conflict, but that didn't make it any easier to watch him be disrespected. As much as he wanted to fix things, to make it right, he also knew this wasn't a battle that could be won in a single day. The next morning, Thomas was back on his farm, tending to the crops as if nothing had happened. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the fields. The rhythmic hum of the tractor and the familiar scent of soil brought him a sense of peace he hadn't felt since stepping foot in that showroom. But even here, in the quiet of his land, the weight of the encounter lingered. Every now and then, his mind would drift back to the faces of the men who had laughed at him, their judgmental eyes burning into his memory. He tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the work that had always grounded him. Marcus, however, wasn't ready to let it go. While his father buried himself in work, Marcus dove headfirst into research. He wanted to know everything about the company that owned the showroom, its policies, its leadership, and whether there had been other incidents like this one. What he found only fueled his determination. It turned out that the company had a history of complaints from customers who felt they'd been treated unfairly, though none of the cases had ever made it far. Marcus suspected that most of the people involved had been silenced with empty apologies or small settlements, their stories swept under the rug before they could gain traction. But Marcus wasn't interested in money or hollow words. He wanted accountability. Meanwhile, Thomas began noticing subtle changes in the way people treated him around town. The story of his encounter at the showroom had spread, but he wasn't sure how. Some people offered quiet words of support, while others seemed to avoid him altogether, as if associating with him might bring trouble their way. It was a strange and uncomfortable shift, one that made him wonder if he'd made the right decision by calling Marcus in the first place. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, overlooking the fields, Marcus shared what he'd learned. "This isn't just about you, Dad," he said. "There's a pattern here. Other people have been treated the same way, but no one's been willing to take a stand." Thomas stared out at the horizon, the fading light casting long shadows across the land. "I'm just a farmer, Marcus. What difference can I make?" "You're more than that," Marcus insisted. "You're an example of what's possible when you refuse to give up. You've built something incredible here, something they can't take away from you. If you speak up, people will listen." Thomas didn't respond right away. He could feel the weight of his son's words, the truth in them, but he also knew the risks. Standing up meant putting himself in the spotlight, inviting scrutiny and criticism. It meant opening old wounds and facing the pain head-on. And yet, deep down, he knew Marcus was right. This wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. The next day, Thomas found himself staring at his reflection in the mirror, his face lined with years of hard work and resilience. He thought about everything he'd endured to get to this point, about the sacrifices he'd made and the battles he fought. He thought about Marcus, about the fire in his son's eyes and the belief that things could be different. Taking a deep breath, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. On the other end was a local journalist he'd met once, a woman named Lisa who had a reputation for telling the stories no one else would. When she answered, her voice warm and familiar, Thomas hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "I need your help," he said. "There's something I need to talk about." The conversation that followed was both cathartic and nerve-wracking. Thomas recounted the events at the showroom, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. Lisa listened intently, asking questions and taking notes. By the time they hung up, Thomas felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. He had taken the first step, but he had no idea what would come next. As the days passed, the story began to take shape. Lisa reached out to other people who had similar experiences, weaving their voices into a narrative that was impossible to ignore. The article, when it finally published, was raw and powerful, shining a light on the systemic issues that had allowed such behavior to persist. Thomas's name was at the center of it, his story serving as both a catalyst and a symbol of resilience. He received calls and messages from people he'd never met, some sharing their own experiences and others simply offering words of support. The attention was overwhelming at times, but it also gave him a renewed sense of purpose. And yet, the battle was far from over. The company responded with a carefully worded statement, denying any wrongdoing and emphasizing their commitment to diversity and inclusion. It was the kind of response that sounded good on paper, but did little to address the real issues. Marcus, however, wasn't deterred. He began organizing a coalition of people who had been affected, bringing them together to demand real change. For Thomas, watching his son step into this role was both humbling and inspiring. It reminded him that, no matter how difficult the fight, they weren't in it alone. But even as they gained momentum, the challenges grew. Anonymous threats began to surface, warning them to back off. The local community became divided, some rallying behind them while others accused them of stirring up trouble. And through it all, the question loomed, would it be enough? Would their efforts lead to meaningful change, or would they be met with more doors slammed in their faces? Thomas didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't backing down. Not now, and not ever. As the days turned into weeks, the story of Thomas and the discriminatory treatment he faced continued to gain traction. What had begun as a single article written by Lisa now spiraled into something much larger. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a broader conversation about systemic racism in business practices. Social media became a powerful tool for amplifying voices, with hashtags calling for justice and accountability trending for days at a time. But with attention came scrutiny. Thomas found himself under a microscope, his entire life examined and dissected by people who didn't know him. Some questioned his intentions, accusing him of seeking fame or financial gain. Others dug into his past, hoping to find something they could use against him. It was exhausting and disheartening, but Thomas refused to let it shake him. He reminded himself of why he had chosen to speak out in the first place, not for himself, but for every person who had been silenced or overlooked. Marcus, on the other hand, embraced the chaos head-on. He threw himself into organizing rallies and meetings, working tirelessly to bring people together. He coordinated with lawyers, activists, and community leaders, ensuring that their movement had both visibility and structure. His energy was contagious, and even Thomas couldn't help but feel a spark of hope when he saw his son in action. One afternoon, as they prepared for a major community gathering, Marcus received a call from an unexpected source, a high-ranking executive from the jet company. The man's voice was smooth and measured, oozing with professionalism, as he offered to meet with Thomas and Marcus privately to discuss a resolution. Marcus was immediately suspicious. He relayed the message to Thomas, who sat quietly for a long moment before speaking. "They're trying to make this go away," Thomas said, his tone thoughtful. "They think if they talk to us behind closed doors, we'll settle and stay quiet." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "They're scared. They know we're gaining momentum." "Maybe," Thomas replied. "But this isn't just about us. If we take whatever deal they're offering, what happens to everyone else who's been affected? What happens to the truth?" The conversation weighed heavily on both of them. It was tempting to imagine a resolution, to think about finally putting all of this behind them. But neither of them could ignore the bigger picture. They knew that their decision would set a precedent, not just for themselves, but for everyone watching. Meanwhile, the threats against them continued to escalate. One night, Thomas found a hateful message spray-painted on the sign of his barn, the words cutting deep despite his best efforts to stay strong. Marcus insisted on reporting it to the police, but the response was lukewarm at best. It was clear that not everyone in their small town supported their fight for justice, and the realization was both sobering and infuriating. Still, Thomas refused to be intimidated. He spent hours scrubbing the paint off the barn, his resolve hardening with every stroke. When he finished, he stood back and looked at the clean wood, his chest swelling with a quiet pride. They could try to scare him, to break him, but they would never succeed. His roots were too deep, his spirit too strong. The community gathering that weekend was a turning point. Hundreds of people showed up, some traveling from neighboring towns to show their support. There were speeches and testimonies, each one more powerful than the last. People shared their own experiences with discrimination, their voices trembling with emotion, but steady with conviction. It was a reminder that this fight wasn't just about Thomas. It was about all of them. But the highlight of the event came when Lisa took the stage, holding a folder filled with documents she'd been gathering for weeks. She revealed that she had uncovered internal emails from the jet company, emails that showed a pattern of discriminatory practices and a deliberate effort to cover them up. The crowd gasped as she read excerpts, the words painting a damning picture of the company's culture. Thomas and Marcus exchanged a glance, a mix of shock and determination in their eyes. This was the proof they had been waiting for, the evidence that could turn the tide in their favor. But it also meant the stakes were higher than ever. They knew that the company wouldn't go down without a fight, and they had to be ready for whatever came next. As the crowd dispersed that evening, the energy was electric. People were fired up, ready to take action and demand change. But for Thomas, the moment was bittersweet. He stood on the edge of the field, watching as the last of the cars pulled away, and felt the weight of everything that had led to this point. The fight was far from over, and he had no idea what the future held. That night, as he lay in bed, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. The air seemed charged with tension, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. And deep down, he knew that whatever happened next, it would change everything. The next morning, Thomas woke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. Blinking away the remnants of sleep, he reached for it, expecting to see a few missed calls or texts from Marcus. Instead, his screen was flooded with notifications. News outlets, social media mentions, emails. It was as if the entire world was trying to get his attention at once. For a moment he sat there, overwhelmed by the chaos. Then one message caught his eye. It was from Lisa, and it was marked urgent. Thomas called her immediately. Lisa's voice was breathless, laced with a mixture of excitement and concern. "Thomas, you're not going to believe this. I've uncovered something else, something even bigger. It's not just the jet company. They're connected to a network of businesses that have been systematically shutting out minority entrepreneurs. It's all there in the documents." Thomas felt his heart race. "What are you saying, Lisa? That this isn't just about me buying a jet?" "It's much bigger," Lisa replied. "They're part of a system that ensures people like you stay at a disadvantage, no matter how successful you are. They're manipulating contracts, blocking funding, even blacklisting individuals who try to speak out. This could blow the entire thing wide open." Thomas's mind spun as he tried to process her words. It was one thing to fight a single company, but this was a battle against an entire system. A system designed to keep people like him in their place. It was both daunting and infuriating, a stark reminder of the uphill climb he had faced his entire life. But before Thomas could fully grasp the implications, another call came through. This time, it was Marcus. His voice was tense, his words clipped. "Dad, something's happened. You need to see this." Marcus refused to explain over the phone, insisting that Thomas meet him at the farm. When Thomas arrived, he found Marcus pacing near the barn, his face drawn with worry. "What's going on?" Thomas asked, his chest tightening at the sight of his son's unease. Without a word, Marcus handed him a tablet. On the screen was a video, shaky and grainy, but unmistakably damning. It showed Thomas's farm in the dead of night, shadowy figures moving around the barn. Moments later, flames erupted, illuminating the night as the barn was consumed in fire. The video ended abruptly, but the message was clear. Someone was trying to send a warning. Thomas's stomach churned as he watched the video again. "Who sent this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was leaked online," Marcus replied. "It's everywhere now. People are saying it was arson, that someone deliberately targeted us." Thomas clenched his fists, his jaw tightening with anger. This is what they do. They intimidate, they destroy, they try to make us give up. "But we won't," Marcus said firmly, his eyes blazing with determination. "They think they can scare us into silence, but all they've done is prove we're getting closer to the truth." The video sparked a firestorm of outrage online. Supporters rallied behind Thomas, demanding justice and accountability. But it also brought out the skeptics and detractors, who claimed the fire was staged for attention. The division was stark, a reflection of the larger battle being waged not just for Thomas's case, but for the soul of a fractured society. Amid the chaos, Lisa uncovered another shocking revelation. One of the executives from the jet company had been anonymously funneling money to local officials, ensuring that any investigations into their practices were quietly buried. The corruption ran deep, intertwining with politics and law enforcement in a way that made it nearly impossible to untangle. For Thomas, the stakes had never felt higher. He was no longer just a farmer fighting for his dream. He was a man standing at the center of a storm, a symbol of resistance in a fight that had taken on a life of its own. Every move he made, every word he spoke, was scrutinized and analyzed, his actions carrying the weight of countless others who had faced similar struggles. As night fell, Thomas sat alone on the porch, staring out at the horizon. The barn was gone, reduced to ashes and memories, but the land remained. The fields stretched out before him, vast and unyielding, a reminder of everything he had worked for. He thought about his father, about the lessons he had learned growing up in the shadow of the man who had taught him to till the earth and weather the storms. This was his storm now, and he would face it head on. But as he sat there, the silence was broken by the sound of an engine in the distance. A sleek black car pulled up to the edge of the driveway, its windows tinted, and its presence ominous. Thomas felt his pulse quicken as the car door opened, and a figure stepped out, their silhouette barely visible in the fading light. Mr. Jefferson, the figure called out, their voice smooth and calculated. "We need to talk." Thomas stood frozen on the porch, his heart pounding as the figure approached. The tension in the air was palpable, every step of the stranger echoing louder than it should. When the man stepped into the light of the porch lamp, Thomas immediately recognized him. It was the executive from the jet company, the one Lisa had been investigating. His suit was sharp, his demeanor calm, but his eyes held a quiet intensity that spoke of ulterior motives. "We've been watching you, Mr. Jefferson," the man began, his voice smooth and unnervingly composed. "You've become quite the thorn in our side." Thomas clenched his fists, refusing to show any sign of fear. "If you've come here to intimidate me, you're wasting your time. I'm not backing down." The man smiled a thin, calculated gesture. "On the contrary, I'm here to offer you a solution. You see, this little crusade of yours is becoming inconvenient, but I believe we can reach an understanding." Thomas felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. "An understanding? Is that what you call burning down my barn, threatening my family?" The man's expression didn't falter. "Collateral damage," he said flatly. "Sometimes sacrifices must be made to protect larger interests. But I'm here to ensure this doesn't go any further. Walk away, and you'll be compensated handsomely. More than enough to rebuild your barn and buy 10 jets, if that's what you want." Thomas stared at him, disbelief and fury colliding within him. "You think you can buy my silence? That I'll turn a blind eye to everything you've done, to the lives you've destroyed?" "Everyone has a price," the man replied coolly. "You're no different." For a moment, the weight of everything threatened to crush Thomas. The fight, the losses, the risks, it had all taken a toll. But as he looked into the eyes of the man before him, he saw something that reignited his resolve, fear. Beneath the calm exterior, this man was scared. Not of Thomas, but of what he represented, of the truth he was uncovering. "I have a price," Thomas said, his voice steady. "It's justice, and no amount of money can buy that." The man's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "So be it," he said quietly. "But know this, you're making a mistake, a very costly mistake." With that, he turned and walked back to his car, leaving Thomas standing on the porch, the weight of the confrontation settling over him. But before the car disappeared down the road, Thomas caught a glimpse of something in the back seat. A briefcase, its contents barely visible but unmistakable, stacks of cash, and what looked like a file bearing his name. The next morning, Thomas called Lisa and Marcus to the farm. He explained what had happened, the encounter solidifying their determination to see this fight through. Together, they pored over the evidence Lisa had gathered, piecing together the connections and uncovering even more damning details. It became clear that the network extended far beyond the jet company, implicating high-profile figures in business and politics. As the story gained traction, more people began to come forward. Other minority business owners shared their own experiences of discrimination and corruption, their voices joining Thomas's in a growing chorus of demand for change. The pressure mounted, and soon the authorities had no choice but to launch a full-scale investigation. But just as it seemed like justice was within reach, a shocking twist sent shockwaves through the case. The executive who had confronted Thomas was found dead in an apparent accident. His car had veered off the road late at night, crashing into a ravine. The circumstances were suspicious, and whispers of foul play began to circulate. For Thomas, the news was both a relief and a burden. The man who had been the face of his oppression was gone, but so were the answers he might have provided. The investigation continued, but without a central figure to hold accountable, the path to justice became murkier. In the end, Thomas realized that while the fight had taken an unexpected turn, it was far from over. The system that had tried to silence him was still intact, but cracks had begun to show. His story had sparked a movement, one that couldn't be extinguished by threats or money. As he stood on the rebuilt porch of his farm, watching the sun rise over the fields, Thomas felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long, but he was ready to walk it, for himself, for his family, and for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong.